Now, for the moment you've been waiting for, I'm going to introduce our guest tonight. In her work, Emma Powell harnesses the power of fantasy to create metaphor and narrative. She finds creative inspiration in developing hybrid approaches that merge current technologies and historic processes. And without further ado, I'm going to turn you over to Emma.
Thank you. I want to thank Dale, of course, and the Halide Project and all their sponsors, and all of you for showing up to listen to me. So I first started with alternative processes when I was, I think, a sophomore in college in undergrad. And one of the first processes I used was cyanotype. And early on, I decided I wanted to try to mix objects, photograms, with a actual photographic image underneath. So this was one of the first cyanotypes I ever made. This was one of my very first cyanotypes when I was in undergrad. And I'm using photograms as well as the photographic image. After I first was introduced to alternative processes, I took a workshop in wet plate collodion. I had grown up around photography and in my dad's dye transfer darkroom, and so I really enjoyed the idea of being able to make these historic processes on my own. So I took a workshop with John Coffer and started my junior and senior thesis in undergrad using alternative processes and specifically wet plate collodion. I was working as an assistant in the University Gallery Museum, or Museum Gallery, and my boss gave me some extra sheets of glass that they had, some that were scratched or something wrong. So I used those to make ambrotypes. And I was studying 19th century spirit photography. For anybody who doesn't know, ambrotype is collodion on glass, where on the right you can see a black sheet behind it makes the image clear, versus tintypes, which are on metal. I was studying 19th century spirit photography, which is where they were photographing ghosts. And I really liked this sort of early use of fantasy and photography, kind of playing with what was possible. On the left, you can see Mary Todd Lincoln with both Abe and their son, who died while they were in office. So I was playing with this idea of ghosts, of these things you see out of the corner of your eye and you don't know what they are. So I was using the long exposure of collodion to allow for movement and the sort of mystery in the image. I was looking a lot at Sally Mann, for example, who was playing with collodion in interesting ways and kind of using the mistakes and the happy accidents that can come from this process to create what would can be considered sort of sloppy technique, but really using that to emphasize some of the metaphor and reasoning behind her work. I was playing with how chemical can also suggest this idea of the spirit world, and also researching different ways in the 19th century and into the early 20th century. People were using objects in the act of summoning the spirits. And so I hung a frame and used that as my sort of entry into the spirit world. Here's a camera I was using. It's actually a dry plate camera that I outfitted for wet plate. Got it off of eBay when I was in undergrad. They're probably more expensive now, but it was accessible to me at the time. Poured my own plates and made those images. I was also looking at Dan Estabrook and his use of negative and positive imagery. He also played a lot with spirit and ghost images, as well as objects and how objects can be organized in a way to create a bit of a narrative. Later on, in a follow-up project, I returned to collodion and I used it on laser cut acrylic. So I was taking acrylic in a laser cutter and making different shapes. I also cut the plate holder that could go into the regular plate holder to make these odd shapes fit into the plate holder. So it was a way of kind of experimenting with the laser cutter for these historic techniques. This was one that I don't feel like was as successful. They didn't work, but it was an experiment of laser cutting an image onto the acrylic before making the collodion image. It was just part of the experimentation process. Here was one of the final images where I actually took the image digitally and then figured out the grid and then photographed a large computer screen with each individual panel in collodion to put it all together. Here's another example of the oval. Here's a later project, again, where I returned to collodion. And in this case, the slide in the plate holder actually hit the plate as it was going in or out. I'm not sure. But I really loved the effect that it created and even added an eye on the bird. So I was really embracing some of those elements of the process. For my graduate thesis at Rochester Institute of Technology, I had less ability to use some of the processes, so I was returning to digital. And I photographed old Kodak cameras, and old twin lens cameras have a lens on the bottom that the image is taken through, but an additional lens on the top that shows a viewfinder from above. So I was photographing the viewfinders from above, pointed at different locations around Rochester that had something to do with the history of George Eastman. So it became a photographic biography of Eastman, sort of finding the clues around town that were still related to his legacy. So here he is with Thomas Edison. You can see on the street, there's a large poster with, I think there's Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, and Eastman's in the middle. This was a student of mine who created a body of work where he was imitating old carte de visite and sort of looking at the history of the American West, and specifically the race in the American West. Throughout this project, again, I found things like Eastman's desk and was able to photograph that, as well as a new statue they had just put up on campus. So I found those ties to the story. Eventually, I had the exhibition in what was Eastman's bedroom, bathroom, and closet, and I really loved that connection, direct connection to history, that the images were able to be in such an intimate and personal place to that actual person. Later on, I moved on to return to cyanotype and explore more fantasy personal narrative. So I started to put together slightly surreal, sometimes sort of magical scenes that sort of alluded to a dreamscape. This one actually came together because I was trying to teach my mother how to use Photoshop, and I had a couple images that I'd already taken. This one, I was lying on an ottoman with my hair going down, and I just was showing her how to stitch something into another background, and I just grabbed an image, and I really ended up liking how it worked out, so I went back and more carefully put it all together. I really like work that has to do with fantasy that kind of builds on that. So this Kahn and Selznick image, they actually used photographs from Mars and then stitched their images into them to create these magical scenes. Here's one with my, I think, great-grandfather's glasses and some other objects with the background added in. This one, people often ask how my images come together, and sometimes I have the idea ahead of time. In this case, I sort of had a loose idea, and I stitched it together with a couple different images, and then I went back and essentially reshot myself as the figure with a better sense of how I wanted it to be interacting with, in this case, an image of a polar bear. And sometimes they come together a little bit more in the moment when I'm taking the pictures, but this one was built and made. This is actually a picture I took, I think, of the Natural History Museum in New York City, and it's the same polar bear in a Sugimoto image. I think it's fun. Lately, I've been looking at images like Greet Stern, who created these really surreal images from women's dreams in the late 1940s, 1950s. Here's one that I'll break down kind of how this one came together. So I started with what I believe is a grain tower when I was living in Iowa. I photographed these and I thought they sort of alluded to the idea of sort of fantasy towers. I tried a couple different backgrounds, but landed on the trees. And then I added a sky with some clouds to add some drama. Then I ordered on probably Amazon or eBay a little rope ladder. I think it was supposed to be for a ninja figurine or something, and photographed that with my hands and then stitched that into or took out the background, added it to the scene. I jumped on a chair and photographed my legs sort of jumping, hoping it would line up well with the rope ladder. And then I added a shadow onto the tower, inverted it, edited it, and then printed a digital negative on essentially a plastic that's like an overhead transparency material. And I coated the paper for cyanotype, exposed it, processed that, and then I got to the final image. This series, I toned them in tea and wine tannin to create the sort of warmth in the midtones and highlights. This was one image that was different, where it's actually one exposure, where I just over and over had one exposure against a black background and moved to 3 different positions until I got it the way I wanted, and then added a new background. I would look a lot at the work of John Dugdale and how he relates different images to each other and creates these narrative suggestions. This is one where I was playing with shadows and what happens when the shadow doesn't match the figure, and the sort of narrative fantasy that can come from that. This was taken in Colorado Springs near Garden of the Gods when I was going to do a workshop, to take a workshop from the Park Harrisons, Robert and Shanna Park Harrison. And this was years and years before I had any idea I was going to move to Colorado Springs, where I now live. So this one's special to me because of that connection. Robert and Shanna are big influences of mine. I've been looking at their work for years, and it was a real pleasure to get to work with them at Anderson Ranch. At the same time, my mother, Kirsten Hoving, was working on a project about quarries, and particularly looking at the quarries that Bertinsky photographed, and then making her own photographs of those. And she came along to the Park Harrison workshop with me. This is another series she was working on, where she was freezing photographs and objects in ice and then melting them and photographing them. They specifically were related to different constellations. So this was Cygnus the Swan. At that workshop with the Park Harrisons, we went down into a grotto, a cave that still had ice in it in the middle of July. And we photographed this sort of mini series that we later decided was Persephone sort of entering the world to create spring. And we decided through this adventure that we wanted to work directly together on a collaborative series. So we started to brainstorm, started to come up with ideas for a true collaboration where we would be working together. She has taught art history, and specifically history of photography. So we have certain points of reference, such as pictorialism and certain elements that we knew we wanted to think about as we were making different work. Here's another image from that series in the cave. This led into the project we called Svala's Saga, where we photographed in Iceland. We did 2 trips, both about 2 weeks each, and we photographed basically the whole time we were there as much as we could. And then we came back and I did the digital editing and the printing, and we worked together on a narrative sequencing in the storyline. So the The images were made with me playing the character throughout. And the idea is that she's sort of a guardian figure for birds and has to go on this epic quest once she's realized they've disappeared, and she has to recover them. This is one image where we went on the first trip and photographed a slightly different figure, and then decided it wasn't dramatic enough. So we actually found the same beach and rephotographed a second time. The little doorway at the top was a picture that I took many years ago in Greece that I stitched in to create more of a fantasy element. And I moved the figure further up onto the rock to add more drama to it. This was right around the corner from that kind of wall. And it was a little cave on one of these black sand or lava sand beaches. And from the first trip we went, I started to stitch this together with myself as the figure being, I was there in that scene, but I added the owl. I wanted to add this sort of element of bird. And so we went back and we found that same cave and we took this image. I had mentioned maybe a day or two before that I wanted to try doing something where we made a nest out of my hair, and we'd brought several eggs along with us. I think they weren't quail, but they were some sort of smaller bird. They were smaller than a chicken egg. And we had brought those along. My point with this, I always like to mention, especially to students, is that if I can go back 2 years later and reshoot something, you can go back and redo it to make it better. In the narrative, here is where she starts to sort of take control over her environment in a way. And then she starts to discover eggs. Along the way, we were photographing at both fairly sort of well-known tourist destinations, but we got into the habit of every time we saw a big group of buses or cars, we would pull over because there must be something interesting to look at. So when we were photographing that, there was a whole line of tourists photographing us photographing. We went out onto a glacier and photographed in an ice cave that our guide told us would be melted in 2 weeks. Here's my mother. She was very proud of herself for going onto the glacier. And towards the end of the series of the narrative, the birds have returned. When we shot this, a big wave came in and I got kind of soaked. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how I made the prints. So for all of these prints, I printed them with palladium over digital color. So I take a printmaking paper, I used Arches Platine, and I print just the color and the registration marks onto that paper. It's not a paper that's coded for inkjet, but I put it through the inkjet printer anyway. And it's the full size of the final print. And then I print a negative on that same transparency material with the registration marks opposite. And I edit it to control where the color is going to come through. So I maybe make it a little bit lighter or kind of control where I want, say, something to look really blue in this case. And then I paint the palladium chemistry directly onto the paper. I usually give the underprint a day or so to dry. I've had better luck if it's dry. Then I paint the chemicals on. Once they're dry, I register the negative on top of that underprint and tape them together and expose them to UV light. And then process it for the palladium chemicals. And the idea here is I wanted something that would feel like an illustration, that would evoke sort of a historic photo process, but not have a really defined time period like certain photo processes, but evoke illustration. And allow you to sort of suspend your disbelief and believe the narratives we're coming up with. I learned this technique from Dan Burkholder, who was teaching it when I was a TA at Maine Media. So it's not something that I came up with on my own, but I've developed my own workflow. Barbara and Lindsay also do a similar thing where they're doing a digital underprint and then a alternative process on top of that. So I was looking at that a lot, and I always would share this with my students too. Here's one of my students' pieces where he did color under a cyanotype and photographed water, buckets of water falling on top of a bench. So in this case, he was adding additional color to create an interesting color combination. One of my students who was a grad student when I taught at Iowa State University was using a combination of Van Dyke Brown along with cyanotype. In this case, the cyanotype's a little bleached out, so you can't see it as much, but she was painting it on in a really sort of loose, creative way, and then painting details into that. Here's another example where you can see a little bit more of the cyanotype. I also really like when artists use interesting materials with alternative processes, because it's one of the magic things about alternative processes is that you have the ability to use it in different unique ways. And this sort of leads into one of my more recent projects where I'm doing cyanotype on top of linen and other fabrics. And I'm combining photograms with photographic images, similar to that very first image that I showed of my first cyanotype. So in this case, actually, I sort of cheat. I don't use a contact frame, but I use L pins to stick the cloth onto a big sheet of blue board or foam board. And then I also pin down the negative on top of that. And then I lay the objects on top. And that allows me to also move the objects around during the exposure. In this case, I removed most of the knives and the spoons before the end of the exposure, so there's a little bit of the wave of the water. And then that one knife in the middle I left for the full time, so it's bolder than the others. This was one of the first images that I made within this series, where I used the image. This was at the very end of COVID, and like many people, I let my hair grow out and didn't cut it during most of COVID, so I had very long hair. And when I went to the hairdresser, who happened to be a friend of mine, I asked if I could keep my hair, not really knowing what I wanted to do with it, but thinking that I might have an idea or might be able to use it in my work. And so here was the first one where I tried sort of putting a photogram object on top as well. And then this is the image that this evolved into, where I added hair and scissors, sort of move things around during the exposure. And these are on linen. Here, this is sort of a test for 2 images. And here are the final prints on display at Bell Projects in Denver. They're going to be up through the end of April. So if anybody's around Denver, go check them out. This was one where I used pens. Throughout this series, I'm calling it When It Rains, and there's sort of objects coming down. Dale, how am I doing on time?
You're doing great. It's just about 7:30, so do what you will with that info.
Okay, so this whole series, I'm actually going to back up and talk about it with this one for a second. The series kind of grew out of a couple things that happened in my life where in sort of middle of 2020, my partner's father passed away from cancer, and we ended up going to his house and helping him sort of and his family through the end of his life. And then eventually we moved into the house and brought all of our stuff along with his stuff. We ended up with an abundance of just everyday objects. We ended up having to go through the kitchen, figure out what of his stuff we wanted to use on a regular basis and what of ours. And we ended up with lots. For example, I think we had 11 spatulas. So we just had a lot of extra objects. And so these were just all sort of in my life at the time. And so I wanted to try to figure out how I could incorporate them into the work. So that's one of the things that started this idea of using the objects, along with photograms being a fairly traditional thing with cyanotype. I then wanted to expand beyond just the objects, although the feathers were Drew's father, Bruce's collection of feathers. He was a fly fisherman, so I think the idea was to make flies out of them. But he had a whole pile of those as well as puzzles and things like that. So incorporating these everyday objects that have this connection to a person was important to me. This one I did on silk and hemp fabric, so it does have a sheen to it, which I enjoy. But I also liked this idea of the figure kind of hiding from the pens and that suggestion of writer's block. For now, I'm using images that are mostly from my sort of back catalog of images that I've taken for previous projects. But I'm also thinking about ways that I can make new imagery to be the image behind it. I recently went to Cumberland Island off the coast of Georgia with pig's fly retreats, along with my mother, and we were working together to photograph some new projects there as well. But along that trip, I collected a bunch of dried, clean bones that I believe were mostly either horse or deer, because there are wild horses on that island. And so I brought those back again, not knowing what I would do with them. And so I used them for the one on the left. And then the one on the right is a little sort of toy ladder and nails. Again, this sort of everyday objects that we have in abundance in the house and that we're dealing with. So that's what I've got on here.
Thank you, Emma.
Sure.
It was interesting to see your previous work, like your wet plate work, because I'm most familiar with your cyanotype, your newer cyanotype stuff. So it was really interesting to see that background, and also how you kind of came full circle to do like the image / photogram combo in the new work. So that was really cool.
Sure.
If anybody has any questions for Emma, you could put them in the chat and I'll relay them. We also have the option to do the raise hand function. So if you want to ask your question with your voice rather than typing it out in the chat, you can do the raise hand function, and I'll give you like permission to unmute, and you can ask away.
Yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free.
All right, Julia, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I love your talk. This was really fascinating. And I was wondering, do you use platinum and cyanotype that often? I know you were mentioning platinum with the color and then making digital negatives. I'm just curious if you've ever done that with the cyanotype as well.
I use palladium rather than platinum. The only difference is you get a warmer tone, which I felt like matched the lava rock in Iceland. And it's a whole lot cheaper. Platinum's extremely expensive.
Yeah.
I haven't done much combining platinum or palladium and cyanotype, but I've seen some really beautiful examples. So I know it can be done in really interesting ways, but I haven't done that myself.
Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Sarah has a question in the chat. She's wondering how you recommend learning the techniques through Photoshop to incorporate into the cyanotypes.
To learn Photoshop or to learn alternative processes?
It sounds like to learn the Photoshop end of creating the composite negatives. Am I interpreting that correctly, Sarah? You can pop your answer into the chat.
Well, I can answer both.
Okay, go ahead.
For Photoshop, if you're just getting started, there's lots of tutorials on things like YouTube and different virtual classes. With Photoshop, I find it's helpful to just kind of dive in and start experimenting with it, but there are some tricks in terms of figuring out how to do things. The thing that I would learn first would be masking, because if you want to start collaging things together and trying to stitch things together, then masks really make a huge difference in your ability to control what's visible on each layer. So layers and masking are the thing to do if you want to collage. And then alternative processes, there are places like the Halide Project and lots of other programs that have workshops where you can learn in person. I don't think there are quite as many virtual opportunities for alternative processes, but I'm sure there are some out there. Yeah. With alternative processes, I think it makes a difference to learn in person because there's so many kind of tactile techniques and things that are helpful.
Yeah, Maze has a related question. They're wondering if you recommend any specific workshops or specific instructors for alternative processes, and specifically Palladium, but if you have anyone in particular you'd like to recommend for any of the processes.
One thing that comes to mind is Christopher James wrote a book on alternative processes that has several editions now. That is sort of the alternative process Bible in a way. It's got tons of processes and really clear instructions, things like that. So that's one place to start. He teaches workshops, I believe, at Main Media and maybe other places. Brenton Hamilton's been teaching alternative processes for years. There's lots of people out there that are teaching that are good at it. I teach workshops in Cyanotype and Van Dyke Brown and digital overcolor occasionally. I don't have anything on the books right now, but stay tuned.
I put a couple of those names in the chat for people if you're unfamiliar with them. Linda is asking if you find fabric difficult to coat or to work with. Does the fabric cause the image to be any less sharp?
The fabric I'm using is very textured, and because I'm not putting glass or anything on top of it, it's not quite as well sandwiched. But I haven't found any, I mean, they're not as sharp as a print is, but I haven't noticed it being uncomfortably sharp, for lack of a better word. If I were using something really, really smooth, I don't think it would be much less sharp. In terms of coating it, it absorbs a lot more chemicals, especially these sort of thicker linen type material. So one of the advantages to doing them in Cyanotype is that Cyanotype's not nearly as costly as something like Palladium or Platinum. So I can use, buckets of chemistry in order to coat it. The way I've decided to coat these is to pin them flat to the blue board and then paint it on. But I know people who dunk it into chemistry as well. There are different ways of doing it. I've just found that this way works for me. And I coat it on really thickly. And because I do that, then I have to wait at least a day for it to dry. I do find Cyanotype, it doesn't go bad entirely, but it loses some contrast and isn't as fast if you wait too long to use it. So after a couple days, it does reduce its kind of quality in a way. Did I get all the pieces?
I think so. But Sarah's asking if you have a favorite brand of Cyanotype and if you prefer sunlight for your exposure or a UV unit.
I use Bostic and Sullivan for pretty much everything, unless they don't have it. They actually have workshops as well over the summer, I believe. So that would be somewhere to look if you're on that side of the country too. They have kits or they have raw materials. Cyanotype is fairly easy to mix, so I just mix my own. And it does go bad over time. So I think it's the ferrochromium citrate tends to mold if you don't add chemicals in it to prevent that or keep it in a refrigerator. So it can go bad over time. And I find, again, it loses a little bit of something, maybe contrast or speed if it's too old. So I like to mix my chemicals fresh on occasion and keep them as A-B chemicals, and then mix those two together when I want to use them. if that makes sense. It's two chemicals to make the one, and they're 50, depending on how you mix them up, they're generally 50-50. So I keep them as the two separate chemicals in bottles and then mix those together when I'm ready to use it.
Tony's wondering if you've had any difficulties with sizing papers, specifically with registration on a print that needs multiple layers of application and exposure.
Sizing being that the paper's already coated with, or something that I'm adding?
Yeah, I guess, are you adding sizing?
I don't add any sizing. Some people, especially for things like gum, will remove the sizing, or pre-shrink paper. And ideally that would be the way to work. But because I'm putting the paper through the printer, I don't want to pre-wet it and risk it warping at all. So I put it through with the sizing on it. And one thing that I do to avoid any sort of problems with alignment is that I make the underprint, the color, a little bit out of focus. So I blur it a little bit so that if there are lines that don't match perfectly, you don't notice it as much because there's a little bit of give. And I do know that, for me at least, the negative and the underprint, once the underprint is coated, they rarely line up perfectly. So it's sort of a guessing. You just try to get it as close as you can. And by making it a little bit blurred underneath, it helps make that more forgiving.
Maze is wondering what equipment you use for printing your digital negatives.
I use an Epson printer. I have a P600 for the small things, and then I have an ancient 9800 giant printer for my larger negatives.
All right, that's all the questions we have in the chat right now. If anybody wants to add any or raise your hand to ask in person, go ahead and do that. I'll also get a transcript of the chat, which I'll save and I'll share it with Emma. So if you have anything you want to put into the chat that's not necessarily a question, but a comment, feel free to put that in because I'll share it. Like I said, I'll share it with Emma after the fact. But we do have a couple.
I do use curves. Curves are very important for alternative processes. I mean, there's always exceptions, but I do find curves to be really helpful. I use easy digital negatives. There's a book out there. I don't think they're all that easy, but they're helpful. But places like Bostic and Sullivan usually release the curves that they've created. Ideally, you want a curve that's going to match your printer, your substrate. So whether you're using Pictorico or Fixins or another brand, you want that, and then you want the process, and ideally your lighting and everything. So if you make them yourself, then it's going to be fine-tuned to your own workflow. But using pre-made curves from someone like Bostic and Sullivan is a really good place to start. Kind of acetate. Okay, so for the acetate, I use Fixins, Fixxon, which I just like how their brand, and it's a little bit cheaper than Pictorico, but Pictorico is also really good. And I said what printer? P600.
Yeah, Linda says she loves your storytelling.
Oh.
And how you make everyday objects seem magical.
Thank you.
All right, last chance for questions and comments. Anything you want in the chat, or raise your hand if you want to ask in person. All right, if nobody, oh wait, Sarah. All right, Sarah.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay, well, I just wanted to really say thank you to you guys. This has been really inspiring. I love your work, Emma, and what you guys are doing with the project, and it's definitely getting me hopeful to keep going, because I haven't had the best of luck in the beginning. I'm sure that you guys know that, so it's a little, it's fun though, the process, but I just really wanted to say thank you guys, that's all.
You're welcome. You can do it.
Thank you.
It's one of those things that just takes a lot of practice, and it takes just experimenting with different things. So I think if you go into it with a mindset of experimenting and being excited with what you come up with, then you'll be happier. And then it's just a matter of fine tuning and figuring out how is best for your own workflow.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well said.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for
Do
coming.
I ever exhibit multiple variations? So this one, I have 2 variations of it at 2 different galleries in Denver right now for a month of photography. And so for this one, I tried to make the same knives in the same places, but there are some differences to it. But I see these as being a variable addition, so that there's an addition to it, but because it's photograms, they're never going to be exactly the same. I think that's what the question was asking.
I think so. Yeah.
How large are my prints? So Svala Saga, I print in 11 by 14 and 16 by 20. And then occasionally I'll sell 8 by 10 prints. And I actually have created a book of that series, and I sell it with an 8 by 10 print, but I don't make 8 by 10s of everything. The In Search of Sleep series was mostly for 11 by 14. I printed a couple of them in 16 by 20. And then some of the other things are smaller. The newer series, the When It Rains, the cyanotypes on cloth are bigger. So there's a whole range there of sizes. Let me see if I can look at my notes. There's some anywhere from kind of 11 by 30 to 16 by 20. I think 16 by 20, or maybe even sort of 9 by 20 is probably the smallest they are. I think this one's somewhere in the like 20 by 28 range. So for the linens, I actually I stretch them like a canvas. So I get a wooden stretcher and stretch them on that, and then I've exhibited them. So here's an example of them actually hanging. So I just, attach a regular hook on the back, or, what's the word? The wire. Same with this one. So yeah, all of these, I do that because it's fabric. It's pretty easy to stretch.
So you stretch them after the exposure and then prior to being exhibited?
Once they're dry, I spray them lightly with some water to loosen the fabric up a little bit when I stretch it, so that then they shrink down a little tighter. And then I do retouch them a little bit. So I'll use a little watercolor paint, because with cloth, there's almost always a few little spots and things, places where it didn't quite work. And so I'll paint them in. I do frame my other prints. I generally prefer an over mat. So I use, 3-inch or so mat around them, and then either use a black or a wooden frame. I don't think I had any pictures. The exception to that was the George Eastman work, where because the image already sort of naturally had this black border to it, I didn't add a mat and just had a spacer, had them framed with a spacer so that it goes all the way to the frame. The tintypes, I have shown them scanned and then digitally printed and framed. And I've shown them for this series. What I did was I actually had little sort of shadow boxes and then laid them in the shadow box, so I had a black background behind them. And then for some of them, I had a little shelf and kind of leaned them on the shelf with a black background. For the bees, I made a mobile. So for some of these sort of oval circular ones, I laser cut an additional hole in it, and they made a mobile of them all kind of hanging from
nice.
the mobile. So those I have to be a little more creative. This one with the hives, I attached a spacer on the back of it that I hang, so it's kind of a solid piece, so there's no frame on that one.
All right, any other questions? Comments? Anything you want to share with Emma?
Thank you.
Tony thinks it was a very successful acrylic cut.
Oh, thank you.
Your experimentation.
This one. I didn't feel it was quite as integrated as it could have been, and so I kind of embraced more the shape of the plate rather than etching into the plate. One of the things that I had an issue with was it was kind of peeling off. The collodion itself was peeling off in the places where the acrylic design was, which just didn't quite work for me. But I was impressed by how well the collodion stuck to acrylic, which I wasn't expecting. So that was a fun discovery.
I like the fact that you shared some images that you thought weren't fully successful too.
Thanks.
Well, it's good to show the experimentation, and you know, someone is, I think Sarah was talking about maybe like getting a little bit like, it's never going to work, but to show that you do have to do a fair bit of experimenting to get to where things are consistently working, I think is important for people.
One of the things that I've learned is that with cyanotype, it's one of the easiest processes to start off with because it only requires water to develop. It doesn't require all these additional chemicals. But then when it comes to trying to make work that is an addition, is when you try to replicate it, it can be really difficult. So it can be fussier in some ways, but easier to start off with. Versus something like palladium, which I found has been just more consistent in how it's printed if you have your environment consistent, so humidity and temperature, things like that. If you keep the darkroom environment consistent, then the prints tend to be a little bit less fussy than something like cyanotype. And when you get into toning cyanotype, then it's all out the window. It's very hard to make prints that are identical.
It's fun.
But that's part of the fun of it, is the like wrangling, the collaboration with the chemistry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's something nice about having a more open edition where everything's not precisely the same, where you're not just like cranking out a bunch of prints, or each one has its own like unique personality.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
All right. Now's the last chance for questions and comments. I know I've said that like 5 times already, but you guys have some awesome questions coming out. So if you have any more, now's the time. And also comments to share with Emma. Awesome. Okay, it looks like we might be done with questions and lots of thank yous, which I'm going to echo.
Feel free to follow me on Instagram at Emma Obscura.
Oh, I think that
I usually post experiments and things as I create them on there too. And anybody can reach out if you have questions or troubleshooting things.
Wait, we have one last question, maybe two. Shell is wondering, how long do you soak when you're toning? So how long is your toning, the print and the toning?
I do sort of a toning that I've developed where I pre-soak the print in water, then I soak it for a few minutes in tea, then I move it and lay it down on a piece of plexi and kind of wash off that tea, and then I use a bleaching agent, so either sodium carbonate or some really diluted developer to bleach it a little bit to bring out the toning, and then I wash that off. The reason I put it on a piece of plexi is I don't want to soak it in that bleaching agent because I don't want it to overly absorb into the paper. And I want to be able to control it. So I can pour water over it immediately when I've decided it's too far gone. And then I add it, I can selectively put tea back on it. So I can essentially dodge and burn while it's toning. And then I put it back in the tea for a few minutes and then I wash it. So I go through a number of steps. I generally don't just throw things, cyanotypes in the toning, if that makes sense. Wording message. Thank you.
Yeah, good luck, Tony, with your MFA research. And thanks for coming tonight.
Yeah, if you want to do alternative processes in MFA, definitely research the program because not all programs offer that. So do some research or reach out. I might have a list somewhere or something I could suggest.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining
Thank
tonight. Thanks, Emma. It was great seeing your work and hearing you talk about it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
It was our pleasure. All right. Good night, everybody. Hope to see you soon.
Good night.